Hello, everyone. This is Kristen with the LTRC. Thank you for joining us for 10 must-haves for your document review process and technology with our sponsor, Exterro, as part of the LTRC Industry Insight Series held every Wednesday. Our speakers today are Beth King, Jennifer Feldman, and Mike Hamilton. Thank you all for joining us. We will now begin the webinar.
Hey, thank you, Kristen. My name is Mike Hamilton, and I welcome you to today's presentation, 10 must-haves for your document review process and technology. We'll get started with the webcast in just a moment. First, a few brief reminders. Right now, all the lines have been muted to reduce background noise. We do encourage you to submit questions at any time through your webinar control panel. We will hold those questions to the very end of the presentation. This webcast is being brought to you by Exterro. Now, just a quick word about who Exterro is. Exterro empowers legal teams to proactively and defensively manage their complex legal governance, risk, and compliance requirements. We are the only software provider offering a comprehensive legal GRC software platform that automates the complex interactions of privacy, legal operations, digital investigations, cybersecurity response, compliance, and litigation activities. Thousands of legal teams around the world within corporations, law firms, and government and law enforcement agencies trust our integrated legal GRC software platform to manage their risks and drive successful outcomes at a lower cost. So let's get to know our webcast speakers. Had the pleasure of working with these two women before in the past. I think it should be a really insightful presentation. Our first panelist is Jennifer Feldman. She's the co-chair of the e-discovery information management group at DLA Piper. Jennifer, thanks for joining today's presentation. And would you please give our audience a little bit of background about yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Mike, for the introduction. Very excited to be here today. I have been at DLA Piper for my entire legal career, born and raised as a securities litigator, and transitioned into this field as it really started to develop about 15 years ago. And now full-time working with case teams and clients on high-level strategy for issues like we're going to talk about today. So really excited to join Beth and lend to the conversation.
Awesome. Well, our second webcast speaker is Beth King. She is a litigation compliance specialist at Beth's American Wind Technology. Beth, please give our audience a little bit of background about yourself as well.
Sure. Thanks for having me, Mike. Yeah, I have a fairly long and extensive career in complex litigation and trial work, going back to when we used to code documents by hand. I have been with Vestis for 15 years now and take charge of the privacy matters and then also of managing our outside counsel and working with them on data collection and witness interviews.
Great. And what's really great about today's panel is we have two interesting perspectives, right? One from the law firm side, one from the client in-house perspective. So it should be a really insightful 30 minutes. Want to really thank everyone here today that took time out of your busy schedules to share it with us, and hopefully we can give you some insightful best practices. One more housekeeping item: the commentary positions discussed by our panelists today are just that, the commentary positions, and do not necessarily reflect the positions and thoughts of the organizations they represent. So again, please do submit those questions. We will get to those at the end of the presentation. So document review is the most expensive part of litigation and accounts for approximately 75% of all discovery costs. It is used more frequently today than ever before, and legal teams must have a standardized, optimized document review process to ensure defensibility and efficiency. According to this year's ACC CLO report, where over 800 chief legal officers or general counsel were interviewed and surveyed, 41% of those participants plan on sending more work to law firms this year. With new and unstructured data, tight deadlines, and security concerns, it is crucial that your team maintains an airtight review process that sufficiently meets your client's needs. And that's what we're really going to be focusing on today. Or what are some 10 quick hits that you should be adopting to have a more successful document review process, no matter what your personnel is, your caseload, or regulatory requirements are. So let's jump into these 10 best practices. So best practice number one, our first must have is case strategy. So Beth, let's start with you. Why is case strategy the first must have on this list? And how do you typically approach this first step?
Well, sure. Well, first of all, if you're the client, it's all about money and how to manage that. But the reality is, if you don't have a plan, you don't know where you're going. I mean, that's just common knowledge. You can't have a goal if you don't set it. You can't meet your goal if you don't set your goal. So I think that's really an important piece of it. We like to analyze the cost versus benefit right on the front end and the risks involved. And then we need to collaborate with our externals, with our outside counsel, so that they understand our business and understand our appetite for risk. So it's a collaboration effort that I think starts right at the very beginning.
Yeah, that's a really good point there, Beth. And Jennifer, from the law firm perspective, you know, if your client says, hey, this is what we want out of the case, that makes your job easier. Does this reflect your experiences with clients, and what is your mindset and goal in starting the document review process?
Sure. My favorite clients are the ones who stop and think about, like, what is the desired outcome? Unfortunately, a lot of the time it's just we have to get started. You know, we've got to start reviewing the documents, and there's a huge rush to get going without stopping to reflect on what your overall strategy is. So, you know, my mindset and goal is always, let's take a minute, even a day, and think about our desired outcome. Where do we need to be at the end of the day? Are we just reviewing to produce? Are we going to need a privilege log? Are you going to be preparing for depots that you know of already? Can we incorporate that into this workflow? Do you have particularly sensitive issues or information we need to worry about protecting in extreme ways? And really just thinking about all of that in connection with the budget and timelines and deadlines to be able to create a process and workflow that achieves all of those goals and does so with as much efficiency as possible.
So I'm glad you touched on privilege there, because it's a great segue to the next point that we wanted to cover here. So can you talk, Jennifer, about, you know, how you go about defining that privilege process? Who does it, when, and how?
Sure. That depends very much on the client and the case. So many clients have very specific requirements about who conducts privilege review. And that's always a conversation that involves the budget, because the tendency is to have more experienced senior lawyers conduct privilege review, and more experienced reviewers tend to be more expensive. And so it can be difficult at the outset when you're looking at a budget and you don't know how many potentially privileged documents you're going to have to be looking at to have that conversation. But it is possible to get a sense of a client's appetite and palate for how much they're willing to or wanting to spend on a privilege review, and being able to plan accordingly. You know, we have some clients who will tell us up front that they have one or two custodians, maybe it's the general counsel, some very high level C-suite members, and their documents need to be reviewed by the highest levels on the case team. So be it. We have others who say, how inexpensively can we get this done? And you know what? You can get a wonderful privilege review done for about $43 an hour these days with proper supervision. So we do try and at least identify all of that at the outset. Like, what is the budget here? Do you have particularly sensitive areas that are going to require very senior level review? And then also that kind of ties in with negotiating with the other side about whether you're going to have a privilege log, when it's going to be produced, what kind of privilege log, because those things are all changing now too, thank goodness. And we're moving away in some instances from traditional logs. And that's always nice news for clients about exploring ways to maybe prepare a less expensive log and have a less burdensome and expensive process to get you there.
What are your thoughts about privilege and privilege logs?
Well, of course, most often we leave that to our outside counsel to take the lead on the privilege review. But I do agree with Jennifer that you want to do that at the front end. Because also the one thing that it can also do is pare down your review, your initial review, because you could just kind of pull those out and set them aside so you can come back to them later.
It kind of starts you down that process of tiering or phasing out your review, right?
Yes,
It's really
for
good
sure.
point there. So let's move on to the second must-have, and that is leveraging technology. So there are a lot of platforms now that have the ability to automate the review process. So Beth, how much do you do in-house, and how important is it for your law firm or service provider conducting that outside review to be familiar with your platform in-house, or maybe even enters into your own review platform to conduct that review?
Right. I think our preference would be that our counsel would use the same review platform, but that's pretty rare. But however, most of our counsel is familiar with the platforms that we use, which I think is pretty important in any event, because they know the limitations that we may have with our platform. We often do the first cut, depending on counsel. My experience with outside counsel is they want everything. They would rather have everything and pare it down themselves because they're the ones that have to present it, right? But
Sure.
I do think that we like to do a first cut, and maybe it's for an early case assessment, actually, to see if we can't get some resolution before we go down that rabbit hole of spending a lot of money.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And, that's what we've been seeing, or I've been seeing, with our corporate clients out here at Exterro, is that, really treating the discovery process like a funnel, right? And the review process is at the bottom of the funnel, so you can sort of narrow it so you're not spending as much and you're just not throwing everything over to the law firm to sort of go through and review potentially irrelevant data or information. So Jennifer, from your perspective on the law firm side, what are some key features and functionalities you see in document review technology that people should prioritize?
Sure. So the exciting thing here is that we have new tools constantly emerging, and I could spend all day on the phone with vendors looking at demos of their tools. But I think that typically between the client and outside counsel, and if you have a third-party vendor involved, there's usually a host of resources available. And I think it's really important to, at the outset, have a conversation about what tools the client has, what tools the outside counsel has, if it makes sense to involve a third-party vendor, because let's face it, third-party vendors usually have the best technology and tools. And sometimes it's worth a little bit of a spend to save a lot on the back end. And I think there's nothing worse than finding out halfway through a review that there was a tool that you could have used that would have saved you time. For example, I think active learning and continuous active learning workflows are the most underutilized tool in the industry. And if more people took the time to try it, learn about it, understand the benefit, they would be amazed. I've yet to have an experience where a client says we shouldn't have done that. Usually they're just like so excited that we did it because it was so efficient. And that's just because we had a conversation at the outset about the type of case and the type of technology we all had and what might be a good fit. So for me, there's no way to say which tools are right for a particular case, but I think it needs to be part of the pre-review checklist, which is to have a conversation, understand your resources, and figure out whether you can use some advanced tools and analytical tools to get you to the finish line faster.
Just a quick follow-up on that, Jennifer. So when you talk about kind of this advanced learning, sort of artificial intelligence capability, it could really be a differentiator for a law firm, right? Because they can get answers to questions that Beth has as a client faster, right? Do you see that as a differentiator for DLA Piper?
I do. I mean, being able to get to the most important information in your case sooner is a game changer. And for me, that's what active learning does, right? No one wants to find the most critical memo in the file on the last day of a 6-month review. I want to find it in the first couple of weeks when the responsiveness rate has skyrocketed through the roof and we're finding all of the good stuff. It informs your overall case strategy, settlement conversations, a lot of your tactical moves. And so being able to provide our clients and our case teams with that sort of information early on, it changes the whole landscape of how they proceed in a litigation. I mean, going into a 26F conference when you've already found the key documents and you have a chronology put together, there's no greater feeling. And you avoid all those surprises, right? Of the last dribs and drabs. We've made it through the review. Now, what did we find? Who's going to analyze it? It really has upset the apple cart in the best possible way.
Yeah, and it's in the best interest of the client, right? I mean, I know it's a change to the traditional culture of law practice of, attorneys wanting eyes on everything like Beth just talked about, but it allows attorneys to sort of have eyes on everything without actually having eyes on everything, right? Of actually going into every document, right?
Exactly.
Okay, so let's move on to the third must-have, and that is security. So Beth, let's address this topic. Oftentimes, data can be moved between a lot of different organizations within the document review process. We already talked about that a little bit. As the client, what should people be aware of when thinking about security considerations of confidential or highly sensitive data?
Well, I have two things to say about security because I work for a global organization, and you can imagine it is absolutely essential that we protect our people's data, both via the GDPR and the various state statutes and things that happen in other countries. So it's a big issue for us. And I also think that the second most important thing maybe it's the first, maybe they're duo, is that we assume that our vendors have the systems in place that will prevent people from hacking into the system, their system, our system. Because remember, a few years ago, law firms kind of got, a couple of law firms got hacked into because we worry about ransomware or our data being published. So I think as you have the SOC 2 here and you have the ISO, that is super important. No one should work with a vendor if they can't provide that proof.
Yeah, that's a really good point there, Jennifer. Being on the law firm side, what are your thoughts about security? How many clients come to you asking for a vendor risk profile of your security infrastructure?
Sure, we get this request frequently, and it never looks quite the same. So I've had one client who actually wanted to go tour the facility where the actual hard drives were going to be stored, and you needed like a retinal scan to get through several sets of doors. It was like out in somewhere in Arizona. And they wanted to see for themselves where the data was going to be. That's like at the extreme ends of things. I think the caution here is if you're going to be using third-party services, be careful. People say like, what's the differentiator? Why would you choose one third party over another? Well, this is critical. As Beth said, if your third party who's helping you can't satisfy your security requirements, that's a non-starter, right? You can't even consider that these days. Those risks are just too great. And I would say it's important when your client is concerned about security standards to listen to exactly what their concern is, because it varies widely. Sometimes it's an overall concern for process, and sometimes you have to think outside the box about how you can address the concern. I've had clients before who wanted their data reviewed on their premises, even though the data was going to go up into the cloud for a third party to host it. They wanted the people reviewing it to be sitting in a conference room on their premises. And that, I originally thought they had a security concern with the data going to the cloud, but as it turns out, no, they actually wanted like seats in their conference room. And only through a really careful conversation did I figure that out. And that was actually very easy to address. No problem with the cloud. I have a problem with these people all working from home, from Starbucks, wherever, and not knowing where they were. So I would say have that conversation with your client and listen really carefully to what the concern is and how you can address it. And sometimes it's very simple, actually. Sometimes it's just one person's data, like one custodian's data, and that requires special measures. It really varies. So think about it and don't be afraid to have that conversation up front.
In what we've seen with a lot of our corporate clients is, if they have a review tool in-house, Beth already talked about this a little bit, the client would love to have their law firm using the same tool, or even better, entering into the client's review tool. So all that stays with on-premise for that client, and they're aware of those security protocols. So if you are a client or you're working with clients, that is something to be aware of. What solutions do you have access to, or how could you work with your client in a more advantageous way that's going to put their security risks to bed? So let's move over to must-have number 4, and that is managing your team. It goes without saying that it's impossible to conduct an effective review without a deep understanding of underlying issues of the case. Besides the factual background, the review team should also understand what the legal team hopes to accomplish. And I don't want to spend a ton of time here. So Beth, if you could quickly touch on this, because we've already kind of talked about it in step 1, but can you just describe how you go about defining roles and responsibilities with your law firm at the outset of the process?
Again, it's a collaboration, but we know our client's business internally better than outside counsel does. So we can function as an educator, and we can sometimes help with the review team, both educating and participating. But I think having protocol templates that standardize who does what and how the review team works is a good starting place. Not that they can't be revised later, but it's a good starting place. And then we maintain some consistency internally.
And Jennifer, just real quick on this, right? Like, learning about Beth's infrastructure, learning how she collects data, how much it costs to collect data or to review data, what it takes to extract that data. What are some things that you need to know from a law firm perspective to ensure that you have the right team?
Sure. So you need to understand up front who's got the technical savvy to participate in a meaningful way. And some clients will be very forthright at the beginning that they don't have anyone who's capable of handling collections. You have to be more cautious with the folks who say that they do, and then making sure that person actually can create collections that are forensically sound, defensible, and all of that. That's a dialogue with your client early on. Who's going to track the collections? Who's going to track the processing? Who's going to be the key point of contact with an outside vendor if there is one? I wanted to touch just briefly on identifying and securing your team, though, because I think this is overlooked frequently. People will often just take a team of contract attorneys from an outside vendor, and they don't really know who they are. So I just want to urge people, I review resumes every time. I could tell you every single person on my team and where they went to school and what they've been doing and how long they've been reviewing documents. And I reject people all the time who don't have enough experience and I don't think aren't a good fit. And if you're going to hire a review manager or someone to join a team with your client on a longer term project, interview them. Any vendor who's worth their 2 cents will let you interview this person because they're a reflection of you and they're going to collaborate with your client, and it needs to be a good fit. Not just that they're technically capable, but that they can participate well, communicate effectively with your client, and just that it's going to work. So I want to just put a plug out there to actually take some time and be thoughtful about who you put on your team when you have the choice. Sometimes it's all our internal people, and that's great. But when we start bringing in outside folks, I think there's a tendency to not screen them and think about who's joining your team and for how long and in what capacity.
Makes sense. So let's get to the back end of these 10 must-haves. And the 5th one is effective protocol and training. And so, Jennifer, what have you found to be most effective when it comes to protocol and training for your document review team? What are some of the most common mistakes you see when people try and define roles and responsibilities?
Sure. The most effective training and protocol, I think, is a combination of a solid written protocol and then an oral presentation where someone from the client or the case team actually explains what this is about. What is this story? What are we fighting about? Why do we care? Like, why is this important? You really get a lot of buy-in. Biggest mistakes I see are overly lengthy training materials that are meaningless, just a copying pasting a bunch of like pleadings or memos and briefing that don't have anything to do with anything. You will get a little bit of analysis paralysis when you give a team too much to try and absorb. So I actually think the best ones are the short and sweet. Here's a little background, like a paragraph. Here's what this is about. Here's your job and the decisions you have to make about the documents. And here's some helpful information, cast of characters, timeline, things like that. But when you get beyond that, I think that's when things start to go awry.
And so moving on to the sixth must-have, and that's identifying review population. We kind of talked about that with that funnel that we referenced earlier about kind of just weeding down to the most relevant data, in reducing your review costs. So how do you go about, Jennifer, working with your clients to execute on this?
Sure. You take a little bit of time. Again, you avoid the let's just get started tomorrow, the data is ready, and you start to think about, do you have noise in your search terms, things hitting on way too many documents that you don't understand? Have someone sample some, look for junk, think outside the box about whether there are whole chunks of data you can put to the side, deprioritize, or avoid entirely. Sometimes you're only looking for internal, sometimes you're only looking for external, and that original cast of the net is too wide. So for me, the struggle is getting folks to take the time to stop for a couple of days before starting to reduce the population. You can always reduce it by some quantity. And so I think it's worth that pause, but some people think otherwise and they just want to start. So it's a little bit of a tango you got to do.
Yeah, a little bit of proactive planning goes a long way. And if you're interested, we have a lot of educational ebooks, white papers on exterro.com. If you're interested in learning about, going into the weeds about how you go about narrowing this collection and review set, please go to exterro.com and you can learn more about that there. The seventh must-have is consistency. In the way that you get consistency is through templates and automation. So what are some best practices here that people should be aware of when it comes to templates and automation, Beth?
Well, first of all, I am a big fan of tags, and I like them used right from the beginning because you just never know what's going to be important. And although we can, do keyword searches. So I think the protocol is really, really important. And I'm with Jennifer. I don't think you want to give too much information to people that are reviewing and coding, but I also think it's important for them to understand the story. And I think the story, having that as part of the protocol is important. And then also, I think defining and expanding a little bit on what each of the tags or labels is going to be, it makes a big difference.
Never in the matter of time, let's move over to must-have number 8, and that's efficiency. So why is speed so important? And can you elaborate on what we mean by that?
Sure. Time is money. As Beth said, it's all about the spend. So the longer it goes on and the more hours people are looking at a screen and tagging, the more money you're going to spend. So I think it's important to start that conversation early and try and come up with a realistic burn rate for how quickly your reviewers are going to go, right? What's their pace going to be? We estimate 30 docs an hour based on your coding pain, or 50 docs an hour based on your coding pain. But to be realistic, how many decisions are you making, asking reviewers to make? And then how long is it going to take them to make that? The other thing is monitor it very carefully. So that's critical. I tell everyone who starts a review, by the time you think you're comfortable, a couple days in, send me an email and tell me your burn rate. Don't rely on relativity or to tell you like how many docs they viewed in an hour, or whatever it is. Have people tell you what's happening so that you can then relay that back to the client and say, great news, we estimated 30 docs an hour, but they're cruising at 40 to 45 docs an hour, or hold up, this is taking longer than we thought, we need to kind of pivot. So time is money, and the more efficiency you can bring to the process, the happier everyone's going to be.
Awesome. Well, let's round out the top 10. And I think this is one of the most important ones here. is number 9, and that's metrics and reporting. It's great to have a process and to leverage technology, but oftentimes we see legal teams not really stepping back and evaluating these processes or technology enough. Jennifer, when we reference evaluating success when it comes to document review, what comes to mind?
On time and under budget. That's it. That's all, right? On time and under budget. Obvious things, you have to meet your deadline, not revisiting the same population twice because there was a change. That's always nails on a chalkboard to me. So for a successful outcome for me was well thought out at the beginning so that we didn't have to retread any populations. We had an effective QC, meaning we caught issues early and pivoted as necessary, which also then would lead to not having to go back to redo populations. And coming in under budget, which for me is about having a realistic budget. And I think it's a very hard thing to budget an estimate up front, but a lot of people put very round numbers on it to get started without really drilling down into whether those numbers are realistic, which means a lot of people are on time and over budget, which does not make the clients happy.
And Beth, having a litigation profile, what role does historical data play in evaluating your document review success? Also, when it's time to evaluate your providers to ensure you're getting the best rates, any postmortems that you conduct with your law firms?
Okay, so that's a compound question, Mike. But the client, Jennifer is so right. The best thing ever is to have the project done early and come in under budget. That was such a great statement. And because, we need regular budgets. We need to have a forecast on how the document review is going for a number of reasons internally. And so we use historical data also to do early case assessments for forecasting ballpark costs on future disputes or new disputes that come in. And what we do after every case, of course, is a lessons learned. And we do that both with our counsel and we do that internally because we want to know what we could have done differently and whether there's a way to do it more efficiently. Is there something that we could have done as a client or that the law firm could have done?
Yeah, I think that's really important, especially with all these legal matters that are out there, and just stepping back, reflecting and sort of seeing where those gaps may occur and where there is potential to save some money. Moving on to that last must-have, number 10, that's quality control. So even the most experienced and thorough reviewers are going to make mistakes. Relevant documents might be unintentionally marked as irrelevant, or a document filled with confidential information might slip through the cracks and make it into the production set. So I'm going to pose this to both of you as kind of the last word here. So Beth and Jennifer, what QC measures have you found to be most effective in avoiding these errors? And so Jennifer, let me start with you.
Sure. For me, it's about the substance of the quality control and the timing. Effective QC has to be done early. Otherwise, too much water goes under the bridge and then you're swimming upstream to try and fix the problem. So do it early, do it often, but then also think about quality control, not just in terms of privilege. Think about it when you're looking at your tagging. Have someone on the case team who knows what's supposed to be tagged or had an expectation of what would be tagged. Start looking at samples of what's being tagged and saying, oh, wait, the reviewers aren't getting this right. This is where you're supposed to be tagging, the draft 10Ks, not the other materials. And so I think it's important to get the case team involved because you're trying to create a work product for them. And so they should be involved in seeing if they're getting what they expected, what they wanted, and giving guidance back to the team.
And Beth, your thoughts?
No, I think Jennifer said it all. I mean, I agree with that. And of course, we defer a lot to outside counsel to deal with those issues.
Well, it looks like we're just about out of time. Actually went a couple minutes over. So thank you everyone for sticking with us. Again, big thank you to Jennifer and Beth for taking time out of their busy schedules to share their expertise with all of you here today. So thank you, Jennifer and Beth. And I know we had a couple questions come in, but before we get to those questions, we do have a limited time offer that we wanted to offer this audience. So Exterro Review, Exterro has come out with a new document review solution, and we're currently offering a free trial. You can get 6 months free and 5 terabytes of storage for free. Again, this is at no cost to you. You can try this new solution. And if you're interested in learning more or to schedule a demo, please don't hesitate to get in touch with us at exterro.com. That's again, exterro.com to test out Exterro Review. So here are the contact information for our speakers. If you'd like to follow up and contact them, they've been generous enough to allow us to put their email addresses on the screen here. So jot those down if you would like to do that. A couple questions that we did get from the audience. I'll pose this to both Beth and Jennifer. How would you recommend pushing to switch document review software internally and at a law firm and at a corporate client? So I'll start with you, Jennifer. Have you had to go through that scenario before, and how did you do it?
I've had clients ask about changing software and whether, what are the best arguments to be made to sort of the deciders, the stakeholders, about why a switch should be made. And it's usually about cost and resources. So if a newer technology is more widely accepted, and if someone's looking to be able to collaborate more effectively with outside counsel and experts and things of that nature, that can be a driving consideration. But essentially, it's usually about costs and my experience with other technologies and whether I think they're sort of handicapping themselves by being on another platform.
Beth, what's your experience with document review, e-discovery technology in-house, and making that switch potentially, or adding in new capabilities?
Right. Well, I think what's important, of course, is looking at the costs. What is your budget? Sometimes people want to change their document review platforms because they need something more robust. And I think that could happen. I think it's really important to do comparisons. The ABA has the great tech reports, and they often evaluate software and review platforms, because I think we need to become more educated about it. It's easy to say, oh, I want something different, but is that really the best avenue to go? Because this product, what it does, and there's all kinds of kinks whenever you change document review platforms. So I tend to be more of the mind that make sure that you know why you're moving before you make a move.
Well, I think we're out of time. So thank you again to Jennifer and Beth. And thank you all in the audience for attending today's presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That is all the time we have for today. I would like to thank our sponsors, Exterro, and all of you for attending our webinar today as part of the LTRC Industry Insight Series. I'd also like to thank Beth, Jennifer, and Mike for presenting today. If you are curious about future webinars, please check out the ABA LTRC page or follow our Twitter at LTRC for updates. You can keep up with Exterro at exterro.com. We will now conclude the webinar. Thank you, everyone.